My husband cooked me dinner once, and it nearly destroyed everything I'd built. The smell alone told me something was wrong. Too sharp, too insistent, like it was trying to mask something rotten underneath. I'm Khadijah, CFO of a textile company my parents built from nothing, and I've always trusted my instincts. They've guided me through boardrooms full of men who underestimated the woman in the hijab. But that morning, my instinct saved 2 lives. It was our 3rd anniversary. Amin walked into my home office before dawn, carrying this expensive thermal container, smiling wider than he had in months. He told me he'd been up since before Fajr making this traditional stew. Said I looked pale and needed my strength. The gesture should have melted my heart. Instead, my stomach twisted. Not just from the morning sickness I'd been hiding for weeks, but from something deeper. Something felt staged about his sudden affection. I was 3 months pregnant and hadn't told him yet. The timing never felt right with how distant he'd become. So I lied, said I'd already eaten. He pushed harder than he should have, kept insisting I take just 1 bite. That's when I knew. An hour later at the office, I gave that container to his assistant. By lunch, she was on the floor screaming, blood soaking through her dress. The stew was laced with abortion drugs, enough to kill. She was carrying his child. He'd been trying to murder me and our baby to keep the fortune my family built. Instead, he killed his own son. This is how I discovered my husband was a monster. And this is the story of how I made sure he paid for it. If you want to hear how a quiet woman in a headscarf brought down a calculating killer, stay with me through this. You can follow along to make sure you don't miss what happens when a man underestimates his wife's intelligence. I'll need someone to witness how this ends. The thermal container was Norwegian design, matte black with copper accents. Amin never cooked. In 3 years of marriage, I'd seen him boil water exactly twice. Yet there he stood in my office doorway at 5:47 a.m., this proud smile on his face like he'd just presented me with a diamond. The smell hit me before he'd even fully opened the door. Rich, heavily spiced, with this underlying bitterness that made my throat close up. My pregnancy hormones were already making everything smell like gasoline and regret. But this was different. This was aggressive. He unscrewed the lid with this theatrical flourish, and the aroma bloomed into the room like something alive and hostile. I'd been working since 4:30, reviewing the quarterly reports before our board meeting. The numbers had been bothering me for weeks. Small discrepancies in our overseas accounts. Nothing I could pin down but enough to keep me awake. I'd planned to dig deeper that morning. Instead, here was my husband, playing the devoted spouse for the first time in months. He set it on my desk, right on top of the financial statements I'd been studying. Told me the stew had been simmering since midnight, that he'd used his grandmother's recipe, that I'd been looking so worn down lately. His voice had this syrupy quality I didn't recognize. Everything about the moment felt rehearsed. My hand went instinctively to my stomach, a habit I'd developed since seeing those 2 pink lines 3 weeks ago. I hadn't told him about the baby yet. We'd been trying for over a year before he suddenly stopped bringing it up 6 months ago. Started working late. Started smelling like unfamiliar perfume. Started looking at me like I was an obstacle instead of a partner. I forced myself to smile and told him I'd already eaten, a lie that came easier than it should have. He didn't just accept it. He sat down, pushed the container closer, said I should at least taste it while it's hot. His insistence had this edge to it, like he was reading from a script and I was messing up my lines. The morning sickness chose that moment to surge up my throat. I grabbed my tea, took a long sip, and told him I had a sensitive stomach this morning. Maybe later. He stared at me for 3 full seconds. I counted, before that smile faltered just slightly. Then he patted my hand, said he'd leave it on my desk for when I got hungry, and walked out. I sat there staring at that container for 20 minutes. The smell was making me nauseous, but more than that, it was making me angry. Something about his performance felt calculated, Too many details. Too much effort from a man who'd barely spoken to me in weeks. At 7:15, Aisha knocked on my door. She was Amin's new assistant, hired 2 months ago without my input, despite this being a family company. Young, ambitious, always dressed just a little too carefully for a textile office. She asked if I needed anything, and her eyes went straight to the container on my desk. I made a decision that saved my life. I told her Amin had made way too much, that it would just go to waste, that she should take it for lunch. She hesitated. Appropriately, since taking food from your boss's wife is weird. But I insisted. Even found a proper plate in our break room, transferred the stew myself, sealed it in our industrial wrap. The whole time, my hands were steady, even though my instincts were screaming. She thanked me, said it smelled incredible. I watched her walk back to her desk, and this cold clarity settled over me. I pulled out my phone and texted my assistant, Iman, the one person in this company I trusted completely. Asked her to pull all of Amin's expense reports from the last 6 months, everything. Then I opened my laptop and started searching for what I'd been afraid to look for. By 9:30, I had found the first shell company. By 10:15, I'd traced it to an account in the Cayman Islands. By 10:47, I heard the scream that changed everything. The sound that came from the bullpen wasn't human at first. It was this raw, animalistic shriek that cut through 2 floors of office noise. I was on my feet before my brain registered movement, running toward the source with my heart hammering against my ribs. Aisha was on the floor between 2 cubicles, doubled over, her hands pressed against her stomach like she was trying to hold herself together. The blood came fast. Too fast, spreading across her beige dress in this horrifying dark stain. The plate I'd given her was overturned beside her, the stew splattered across the industrial carpet like evidence at a crime scene. Someone was already calling 911. I dropped to my knees beside her, and she looked up at me with these wide, terrified eyes. She tried to say something, but it came out as just this choked gasp. Her whole body was convulsing. I grabbed her hand and held it, told her help was coming, that she'd be okay. Lies that tasted like copper in my mouth. That's when I saw Amin. He'd appeared from somewhere, standing at the edge of the growing crowd, and his face went through this rapid-fire sequence of expressions I'd never seen before. Shock, confusion, then something that looked like rage mixed with panic. His eyes locked on the spilled food, then on Aisha, then on me. For just a moment, I saw something in his expression that made my blood turn to ice. He wasn't concerned. He was furious. He pushed through the crowd and grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. His voice came out low and harsh, meant only for me. He wanted to know why she had the food. Why her and not me? The emphasis on that last word made everything crystallize. I pulled my arm away and told him I'd given it to her because I wasn't hungry. His face went pale. Actually pale, like someone had drained the blood from his skin. Then he turned and walked away. Didn't stay to help. Didn't call out reassurances. Just left before the ambulance arrived. The EMTs loaded Aisha onto a stretcher within minutes. I told my secretary to cancel all my meetings and rode with her to Dearborn Memorial. In the ambulance, with the sirens wailing and the medics working frantically, I kept my hand on my own stomach and tried not to think about what I was beginning to understand. At the hospital, they rushed her straight into emergency care. I sat in the waiting room for 2 hours, watching the clock and refreshing my phone compulsively. Iman had sent me 3 files of expense reports. I started reading them in that plastic chair under the fluorescent lights, and each page confirmed what my gut had been telling me for months. Restaurants I'd never been to. Hotels during business trips I hadn't known about. Regular charges to a pharmacy in Southfield. The same pharmacy, every 2 weeks, always on Fridays. Amounts that were just small enough to not trigger automatic review, but consistent enough to form a pattern. A doctor finally came out at 1:47 p.m. She was young, with tired eyes and this careful professional expression. She asked if I was family, and I lied and said I was Aisha's supervisor. She told me Aisha was stable but had suffered severe internal bleeding. They'd found extremely high levels of misoprostol in her bloodstream, a drug used for medical abortions. Enough to be lethal in the wrong circumstances. Then she said something that made my world tilt. Aisha had been approximately 6 weeks pregnant. The fetus hadn't survived. I sat there processing that information while the doctor waited for my reaction. 6 weeks. Amin had hired her 2 months ago. I did the math in my head and felt this cold, clear rage settle into my bones. This wasn't just an affair. This was a plan. The doctor asked if I knew how Aisha might have been exposed to such a high dose. I heard myself say I had no idea. That she'd seemed fine this morning. More lies. My life was becoming a tower of lies built to buy time while I figured out the truth. I drove back to the office in a fog. My phone rang twice. Amin's name on the screen both times. I didn't answer. Instead, I called Iman and told her to meet me in my office immediately, to bring her laptop and to make sure no one was around. When I got back to the building, Amin's car was gone from his reserved spot. His office was dark. I went to my desk and sat down, staring at the spot where that thermal container had been just 6 hours ago. Someone had cleaned up the spilled food in the bullpen, but I could still smell it. That bitter, wrong scent that had screamed danger to some primal part of my brain. Iman arrived 15 minutes later. She locked the door behind her and sat across from me with her laptop open. I told her everything. The stew, the insistence, Aisha's collapse, the drug, the pregnancy. With each word, her expression grew harder. Then I told her what I needed. Financial records for every account connected to our company. Security footage from the building for the last 3 months. Everything Amin had touched. Everyone he'd contacted. Every digital footprint he'd left. I wanted it all. And I wanted it yesterday. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Said she'd been waiting for me to ask. Said she'd noticed things too. Late-night access logs, files being moved around. Encrypted folders that shouldn't exist in a textile company's system. She'd been building her own file, just in case. We worked until midnight, building a timeline of my husband's betrayal. When I finally drove home, the house was dark. Amin hadn't come back. I stood in our bedroom, my hand on my stomach, and made a decision. He'd tried to kill me and our baby. He'd accidentally killed his mistress's child instead. And now he had no idea I knew everything. I was going to use that. Amin came home at 2:14 a.m. I heard the garage door from where I was lying in bed, still fully dressed under the covers. His footsteps on the stairs were heavy, uneven. Drunk or exhausted, I couldn't tell. The bedroom door opened slowly, and I kept my breathing steady, eyes closed, playing the role of peaceful sleep. He stood in the doorway for almost a minute. I could feel his stare on me, feel the weight of whatever he was thinking. Then he turned and went to the guest room. The door clicked shut, and only then did I let myself breathe normally again. The next morning, I woke before dawn as usual, performed my prayers with shaking hands, wrapped my hijab with extra care, like armor. When I went downstairs, he was already in the kitchen, making coffee. He turned when he heard me, and his face was this carefully constructed mask of concern. He asked about Aisha, mentioned he'd heard she was in the hospital. His voice had this practiced lightness, like he was asking about the weather. I told him she'd had some kind of reaction to something she ate, that the doctors were still running tests. I watched his face carefully, but he gave nothing away. Then he asked if I'd eaten the stew. Said he'd noticed the container was gone from my office. I told him I'd finished it for dinner, that it was delicious, that I was sorry I'd seemed ungrateful that morning. The lie came out smooth as silk. His relief was microscopic but visible. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. He smiled and said he was glad, that he'd make it again sometime. I smiled back and told him I'd love that. We were both lying, both performing, both waiting to see who'd slip first. I went to work and called the hospital from my car. Aisha was awake, stable, but refusing visitors. The nurse said she'd specifically requested that no one from her workplace be allowed in. Smart girl. She knew something was catastrophically wrong even if she didn't know what yet. Over the next week, I became the devoted wife again. I asked about Amin's day, laughed at his jokes, touched his arm at dinner. Every gesture was calculated, designed to make him think I suspected nothing. Meanwhile, Iman and I were building a case that would bury him. The pharmacy records came first. Iman had a contact whose sister worked at the Southfield location, where Amin's expense reports showed regular charges. With some careful social engineering and a small cash payment, we got copies of prescription records. The name on them wasn't Amin's, it was Mariam Khalil. I knew that name. Mariam had been his girlfriend in college before me. She'd become a pharmacist, and I'd met her exactly once at a company function 3 years ago. She'd looked at me with this cool assessment that I'd dismissed at the time. Now I understood what I'd seen in her eyes. Calculation. The prescriptions were all for misoprostol. Multiple refills over 6 months, always picked up by Amin using her prescription number. Iman pulled his credit card statements and found regular payments to a medical supply company in Canada, places that sold abortion drugs online, semi-legally, no questions asked. He'd been stockpiling for months. I sat in my office staring at the evidence, my hand unconsciously resting on my still flat stomach, and realized the timeline. 6 months ago was when he'd stopped talking about wanting children, when he'd started working late, when everything had shifted. He'd been planning this since before Aisha even started working here. She wasn't the trigger. She was just another variable in an equation that required my death. At home that night, I made dinner. Something simple, traditional. I watched him eat every bite, complimenting the food, asking if I needed help with anything. Playing the husband. I played the wife. Our house had become a stage where we performed for an audience of each other. After dinner, I found my opening. Mentioned that I'd been looking at our investment accounts, thinking about the baby we'd been trying for. Said maybe it was time to update our wills, make sure everything was properly allocated. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. Just for a second. He said that was a good idea, that we should definitely do that. I smiled and said I'd already started drafting some changes with our attorney. Mentioned I wanted to make sure my parents' legacy, the company they built, stayed protected no matter what happened. I saw his jaw tighten. Over the next 2 weeks, I slowly introduced more financial conversations. Talked about reorganizing the corporate structure. Mentioned that Iman had found some accounting irregularities we needed to address. Nothing accusatory, just business. But I watched him get more tense with each passing day. The shell companies I'd found were elaborate. 3 different entities registered in Delaware, all with similar names to legitimate suppliers we worked with. Money had been moving through them in careful increments, never enough to trigger automated fraud alerts, but over 2 years, he'd siphoned almost $2 million from the family business. My parents' business, my inheritance. The accounts all led back to one primary holder, Mariam Khalil. They'd been planning this for years. The affair with Aisha was just a complication, probably why he'd panicked so badly when she got pregnant. The main plan had always been me. Kill me. Make it look like a miscarriage or natural causes. Inherit everything as the grieving widower, and disappear into a new life with Mariam and the money he'd already stolen. Aisha had been leverage, or maybe insurance, another baby to confuse the timeline, to make him seem like the victim of a woman with pregnancy complications. I'd never know exactly what role she played in his mind because he'd tried to erase her from the equation entirely. I printed everything, made 3 copies. One went into a safe deposit box at a bank he didn't know about. One went to Iman with instructions to mail it to the FBI if I didn't check in every 48 hours. The third stayed in my home office, in a locked drawer behind a false back panel I'd installed years ago. Then I scheduled a board meeting for the following Thursday, called it a routine quarterly review, made sure every board member would be there, including Amin. And I called someone I'd been avoiding calling for 3 weeks, my OB-GYN. Made an appointment for a full exam and confirmation of the pregnancy. I'd need that documentation dated and official. On Wednesday night, Amin asked what the board meeting was about. I told him just the usual financial review, nothing special. He relaxed slightly, asked if I'd found anything interesting in those irregularities Iman mentioned. I said nothing that couldn't be explained by normal processing delays. He kissed my forehead that night, told me he loved me. I said it back, and felt nothing but cold determination. He'd tried to murder me, had murdered his own child by mistake, had been stealing from my family for years, had betrayed every promise he'd ever made. Tomorrow, I was going to destroy him, and he had no idea it was coming. The pieces came together faster once I knew what I was looking for. Iman and I worked in my home office until 3 a.m. on Wednesday night, building a complete picture of Amin's systematic dismantling of everything my parents had built. The shell companies were just the surface. Underneath, we found a network of financial manipulation that was almost impressive in its complexity. He'd been inflating overseas supplier costs by 15% for 2 years, then pocketing the difference through the Delaware entities. He'd renegotiated insurance policies to lower coverage, putting the savings into accounts only he could access. He'd even been billing the company for fake consultation services from a non-existent business advisory firm, which was just another name for Mariam Khalil's personal LLC. She was a pharmacist, but she'd registered as a medical and pharmaceutical business consultant 3 years ago, right around the time Amin and I got married. Every month, our company paid her $3,000 for advisory services. Over 3 years, that was over $100,000 for work that never happened. I pulled up her social media. She was careful. No photos with Amin, no obvious connections. But I found a picture from 14 months ago, taken at a resort in the Bahamas. Just a sunset photo with her hand visible. Wearing a ring I recognized. I'd bought it for Amin's birthday 2 years ago, a custom design with his grandfather's stone reset. He told me he'd lost it while golfing. Iman found their flight records. They'd gone to the Bahamas together 3 times in the past 18 months, always when I was traveling for work. He told me he was attending industry conferences. I found the conference registrations. He'd signed up and never attended any of them. But the real revelation came when we accessed his text messages. I'd installed monitoring software on his phone 6 months ago when the distance between us first started, telling myself I was being paranoid. I'd checked it once, seen nothing suspicious, and tried to forget about it. Now I went back through everything systematically. The messages with Mariam went back 3 years, before our marriage. They'd never really broken up. He'd just gotten better at hiding her. The texts spelled out everything. Discussions about how much my death would be worth. Calculations about life insurance payouts combined with business inheritance. Arguments about timeline. She wanted him to act faster. He kept insisting they needed to be careful. References to the pharmacological solution that would look like pregnancy complications. Plans for where they'd go afterward. Dubai, maybe, or Singapore. Somewhere American authorities would have difficulty reaching. Then, 3 months ago, a shift in the tone. Mariam getting angry about someone named A. Amin trying to calm her down, saying it was just physical, that it meant nothing, her demanding he end it. Him saying he needed A for the plan to work, that having an affair with an employee would make his grief more believable, make him seem like a flawed but human widower rather than a calculated killer. They'd choreographed my murder like a theater production, each element designed to build a specific narrative. The morning sickness I'd been experiencing wasn't in their plan. I found a text from 2 weeks ago, where Amin mentioned I'd seemed nauseous lately, asking Mariam if she thought I could already be pregnant. Her response was clinical. It was time to act immediately, before I could confirm anything officially, before doctors' records could complicate the autopsy. That's why he'd made the stew that morning. I wasn't supposed to refuse it. I wasn't supposed to give it away. I was supposed to eat it in my office, alone, and die of what would look like a spontaneous miscarriage of a pregnancy no one knew existed. A tragedy. A medical complication. Terrible. But explainable. Instead, I'd saved myself through instinct and destroyed his entire plan through one gesture of false generosity. I found the recipe he'd used. It was in a folder on his laptop marked Personal Projects. The stew was traditional, something his grandmother actually used to make. But he'd added detailed notes about how much misoprostol to dissolve into the broth, how the spices would mask the bitter taste, how long it needed to simmer to ensure complete distribution of the drug. He'd tested it on himself first, smaller doses, documented in a journal file. He'd wanted to know what the side effects felt like, how long they'd take to appear, whether someone would have time to call for help. That's how methodical he'd been. That's how much he'd wanted to get this right. The journal entries made my skin crawl. He wrote about me like I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle between him and the life he deserved. He referred to my irritating devotion to family business, my naive trust in traditional values, my pathetic religious routine that woke him up before dawn every morning. He'd married me for access to my family's company. He'd spent 3 years positioning himself as indispensable, building relationships with our suppliers and clients, inserting himself into every major decision. He'd become the face of the company while I handled the boring administrative work. When I died, he'd be the natural choice to take over completely, and then he'd sell it within 2 years, pocket the money, and disappear with Miriam into a life funded by my parents' sacrifices. I sat there reading his plans for my death and felt this strange, cold clarity. This wasn't rage. It was something cleaner, more surgical. He'd treated my life like a chess game, so I'd respond in kind. Iman found the final piece while I was reading the journal, security footage from our building's parking garage. For the past 6 months, Amin had been meeting someone in his car during lunch breaks, 30-minute sessions, every Friday, the same time as those pharmacy charges. The footage was grainy, but after enhancement, the woman's face was clear enough. Miriam Khalil, climbing into my husband's car with a pharmacy bag, leaving 40 minutes later without it. She'd been delivering the drugs in person, making sure he had enough, teaching him how to use them. They'd been so careful, so patient. Every Friday for months, building up his supply, planning the perfect moment. I made copies of everything, burned it onto 3 separate drives, packaged them with printed documentation, notarized and dated. Then I called someone I should have called the moment Aisha collapsed, Detective Sarah Brennan, a friend from college who worked in the Dearborn Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. She'd been texting me for weeks, wanting to catch up. I'd been too busy, too wrapped up in work and the pregnancy I didn't know how to announce. Now I had something better than catching up. I had a case that would make her career. We met at a coffee shop in Ann Arbor, far enough from Dearborn that no one would recognize us. I gave her the first drive and a summary of what she'd find on it. Her expression went from friendly curiosity to professional shock to cold determination in about 15 minutes. She told me to be very careful. Said that if Amin realized I knew, I could be in immediate danger. I told her about the baby, the first person besides my doctor I'd told. She made me promise to stay in public spaces, to never be alone with him, to call her immediately if anything felt wrong. Then she told me what would happen next. She'd get a warrant quietly, move fast, coordinate with federal authorities since this crossed state lines with the Delaware companies, but I had to act normal until they were ready to move. Had to keep performing the role of trusting wife. Had to give them time to build an airtight case. I told her about the board meeting I'd scheduled for Thursday. She made me push it to Friday, said they'd be ready by then, said she'd have officers stationed in the building just in case. She asked if I was sure I wanted to be there for the arrest. I told her I wouldn't miss it for anything. That night, I went home and cooked dinner again. Amin complimented the food. told me I seemed more relaxed lately, less stressed. I smiled and said I'd been doing some thinking, that maybe we should take a vacation after the board meeting. Reconnect. He agreed immediately, said that sounded perfect. I watched him eat and thought about all the meals I'd prepared for him over 3 years. All the mornings I'd woken early to pray while he slept. All the times I'd defended his decisions to my parents, vouched for his commitment to the family business. Every moment I'd been building a life while he'd been planning my death. After dinner, he asked if I wanted to watch something together. I suggested a movie about a heist, something clever, with elaborate planning. He seemed to enjoy it. I studied his face in the flickering TV light and wondered if he had any idea what was coming. In our bedroom that night, as he fell asleep beside me, I put my hand on my stomach and whispered a promise to my daughter. Yes. I knew somehow it was a daughter. I promised her she'd never have to wonder if her father loved her. She'd never have to reconcile the man who was supposed to protect her with the man who'd tried to kill her before she was born. She'd grow up knowing only the truth, no matter how hard it was. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes everything feel significant. I dressed carefully. A dark blue suit, professional but severe. My hijab was silk, deep burgundy, pinned precisely. I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. 3 weeks ago, I'd been someone who believed in the goodness of people. Now I was someone who knew exactly how to take one apart. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. Friday, but Thursday was about final preparations. I spent the morning in my office reviewing every document one last time. Iman brought me coffee at 9:30, and we went through the presentation I'd built. Not just the evidence of theft. That would come from Detective Brennan. No, I had something else planned. A corporate restructuring proposal that would strip Amin of every bit of authority he'd accumulated. He didn't know it was coming, because I'd filed it through my attorney on Wednesday afternoon. Emergency board action, requiring immediate vote, citing irregular financial activity requiring leadership oversight. By the time the police arrested him Friday morning, he'd already be functionally removed from power. Even if somehow the criminal charges didn't stick, though they absolutely would, he'd be locked out of the business permanently. My father always told me that real power wasn't about making noise. It was about having all your pieces in position before your opponent even knew the game had started. At 11:15, Amin walked past my office. He paused at my open door, leaned against the frame with that casual confidence he wore like cologne. Asked if I was ready for tomorrow's meeting. I told him everything was prepared, that it would be quick and straightforward. He nodded, satisfied, and mentioned he had a lunch meeting with a potential supplier. I knew better. I'd checked his calendar that morning when he was in the shower. No lunch meeting scheduled. He was meeting Miriam. They met every Thursday now, had been for 6 weeks, probably celebrating how close they were to being rich and free. I'd installed a tracker on his car 3 days ago. A tiny magnetic box under the rear bumper that fed real-time location data to my phone. After he left, I watched the dot on my screen move across Dearborn, away from any supplier we worked with, toward a condo complex in Southfield. Miriam's address. Let him have his lunch. Let them celebrate. Let them feel safe and clever and invincible for one more day. Detective Brennan called at 1:30 p.m. The warrants were approved. Federal prosecutors were on board because of the interstate financial fraud. They'd execute everything Friday morning at 9 a.m., 1 hour before the board meeting. She asked again if I was sure I wanted to be there. I told her I'd be in my office by 7 a.m. as usual. If they wanted to arrest him there, I'd be watching. After we hung up, I sat in the silence of my office and felt the baby move for the first time. Just the tiniest flutter, like a butterfly testing its wings. I put both hands on my stomach and cried for the first time in 3 weeks. Not from fear or anger anymore, from relief. My daughter was okay. We were going to be okay. At 5 p.m., I packed up my laptop and drove to my parents' house. They'd retired to Florida 3 years ago, trusting me to run the company they'd built from nothing when they arrived from Jordan in 1987. I hadn't told them what was happening. Didn't want them to fly back yet. Didn't want them caught in the immediate chaos. But I needed to hear my mother's voice. She answered on the second ring, and just hearing her say my name made my throat tight. I told her I loved her. Told her I was pregnant, her first grandchild. She cried and called for my father, and they both got on the phone asking a million questions. I answered what I could, and promised to explain everything soon. For now, I just wanted them to know they were going to be grandparents. My father asked if Amin was happy about the baby. I hesitated, then told him we'd talk about that part in person. His silence told me he understood more than I'd said. My father had never been convinced Amin was the right choice. He'd been too polite to say it directly, but I'd seen it in his eyes at the wedding. Concern mixed with hope that he was wrong. He wasn't wrong. I drove home as sunset turned the sky orange and purple. Amin's car was in the garage. He'd beaten me back. I sat in my vehicle for 5 minutes, breathing deeply, preparing myself for one more night of performance. Tomorrow, everything would be different. Tonight, I just had to get through dinner without giving anything away. He'd made reservations at my favorite restaurant. When I walked in and he told me, I actually laughed. The sound surprised both of us. He asked what was funny, and I told him it was just nice that we hadn't been out in so long. He smiled like he'd done something thoughtful, instead of checking off a box on his murder husband to-do list. At dinner, he was charming, attentive, asked about my day, told stories about work, reached across the table to hold my hand. Every gesture was textbook Romance 101. I played along, squeezed his hand back, laughed at his jokes. To anyone watching, we were a devoted couple enjoying date night. I ordered the lamb. He got the steak. When the food came, I watched him eat without any paranoia for the first time in 2 weeks. He wasn't trying to poison me tonight. He thought he'd already handled the problem. Thought Aisha's mysterious illness had been his warning that his method worked, that when he tried again, because of course he'd try again, he'd be more careful about who ate the food. He didn't know I'd never given him a second chance. That opportunity had died the moment that stew hit Aisha's lips. Over dessert, he brought up the vacation I'd mentioned, said he'd been thinking about it, that maybe we should go somewhere tropical. The Maldives, or maybe Fiji, somewhere remote and romantic. I agreed enthusiastically, suggested we book something for next month. Watched his eyes light up at how cooperative I was being. In his mind, next month would be perfect. Give me enough time to relax, to feel secure. Then he'd try again, maybe use a different method. Something quieter, harder to detect. Maybe just push me down the stairs. Make it look like an accident with the pregnancy. Tragic. Unavoidable. The waiter brought the check, and Amin paid with a credit card I knew was connected to one of the shell companies. He was using my family's stolen money to pay for the dinner before he murdered me. The irony was almost poetic. We drove home in comfortable silence. He held my hand over the center console. I let him. At the house, he said he needed to do some work in his office, kissed my forehead, and disappeared upstairs. I went to our bedroom and changed into comfortable clothes, then sat on the bed and looked at the woman I'd been 3 weeks ago. She'd trusted her husband completely. She'd believed in the sanctity of marriage, in the goodness of people, in the idea that love could survive anything. She'd been wrong about all of it. But that woman had also been smart enough to trust her instincts, brave enough to investigate when something felt wrong, strong enough to build a case that would destroy the man trying to destroy her. Maybe she hadn't lost as much as I thought. Maybe she'd just evolved into someone harder, someone who could survive. I set my alarm for 5:30 a.m. and tried to sleep. My mind kept running through the timeline for tomorrow. Police arriving at 9. Amin being arrested. Board meeting at 10. Restructuring vote. By noon, he'd be in custody and I'd be CEO. By next week, he'd be arraigned. By next month, Miriam would be arrested too. By the time my daughter was born, this would all be over. She'd never remember any of it. She'd just grow up knowing her mother was strong enough to protect them both when it mattered most. Around midnight, I heard Amin come to bed. He settled in beside me, and I kept my breathing even and slow. He lay there for a while, not moving, just existing in the darkness next to me. Then he said something so quietly I almost missed it. I really did love you once. Past tense, like I was already dead. Like the morning had already started in his head. I didn't respond. Didn't move. Let him think I was asleep. After a few minutes, his breathing evened out, and I knew he was unconscious. Only then did I open my eyes and stare at the ceiling, counting the hours until sunrise, until justice, until this nightmare finally ended. I was already dressed and at my office by 6. 5 a.m., watching the parking lot through my window. The building was eerily quiet, just security and the early cleaning crew. I'd told them there would be police presence today for a sensitive matter, asked them to stay clear of the executive floor after 8:30. They'd nodded without questions. Good people who deserved better than to witness what was coming. Detective Brennan texted me at 7:15. In position. 2 units on site, 3 more en route. Federal agents arriving at 8:50. Stay in your office. I made coffee I didn't drink. Reviewed documents I'd already memorized. Tried not to think about how Amin had kissed me goodbye this morning like it was just another Friday, like he wasn't a man who'd murdered his own child and tried to murder his wife. The cognitive dissonance required to live that kind of double life was something I'd never understand. Amin's car pulled into his reserved spot at 8:47 a.m. I watched him get out, straightening his tie, checking his phone, looking like any other executive starting a routine day. He disappeared from my view as he entered the building. 3 minutes later, 2 unmarked sedans rolled into the parking lot. 4 people got out, 2 in police uniforms, 2 in plain clothes carrying folders. Detective Brennan was one of them. They moved with purpose toward the entrance. I sat down at my desk and waited. The knock on Amin's door came at exactly 9:00 a.m. I heard it from my office. We weren't that far apart. Then I heard his voice, confused but still friendly, asking if he could help them. Detective Brennan's response was clear and official. Amin Nassar, you're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and federal wire fraud. Then came the sound I'd been waiting for. Amin's voice rising in pitch and volume, demanding to know what this was about, saying there must be some mistake, the clatter of objects hitting the floor. Footsteps, multiple sets. His voice again, louder now. This is insane. You can't. I haven't. Where's my wife? I want to talk to my wife. I stood up and walked to my doorway. Our offices faced each other across the hallway. I could see him now. Handcuffs already on, his face red and panicked. When his eyes found mine, everything stopped for a moment. Khadijah, he said, and his voice cracked. Tell them this is crazy. Tell them. I cut him off. My voice came out colder than I'd ever heard it. Told him I knew everything. The shell companies, the stolen money, Miriam, the drugs, every text message planning my death. That morning, he brought me poison disguised as love. His face went through this rapid sequence of expressions: shock, denial, then something that looked almost like respect. How long? He asked. How long have you known? I told him I knew the moment I smelled that stew, that my instincts had saved me, that he'd underestimated the wrong woman. He actually laughed. This bitter, hollow sound. Said I'd hidden it well. Said he'd almost believed I'd bought his performance this whole time. Then his expression changed to something ugly. He wanted to know about the baby, if there even was a baby, or if I'd made it up to build my case. I pulled an envelope from my pocket. My OB/GYN records, official, and dated. Held it up so he could see the sonogram image paperclipped to the front. Told him yes, I was pregnant. That our daughter would grow up knowing exactly who her father was and what he'd tried to do. Something broke in his face then. Not remorse. I don't think he was capable of that. More like the realization that he'd lost completely. That I'd outmaneuvered him at every turn. That the woman he'd dismissed as too traditional, too trusting, too easy to manipulate had destroyed him. Detective Brennan told him he had the right to remain silent, and I wished he'd take that option. But he kept talking. Said I couldn't prove intent. That the stew was for Aisha all along. That I'd interfered. That he'd never meant to hurt me. I let him talk. Let him dig his hole deeper. The federal agents were recording everything. Every word would be used against him. Every desperate lie would make the prosecution's case stronger. They led him away in handcuffs, and I watched until he disappeared into the elevator. Stood there in my doorway feeling absolutely nothing. No satisfaction. No revenge-fueled joy. Just this quiet, empty certainty that I'd done what needed to be done. Iman appeared beside me, her face pale. She'd been watching from the conference room. Asked if I was okay. I told her I would be. Asked her to call the board members, let them know we'd be starting the meeting on schedule at 10. The arrest warrant for Mariam Khalil was executed simultaneously at her condo. Detective Brennan texted me at 9:45 to confirm. Pharmacist in custody. Found documents at residence confirming conspiracy. She's already asking for a deal. Good. Let them turn on each other. Let Mariam trade testimony for a reduced sentence. Let every detail of their plan get exposed in court. I wanted the world to see exactly what they'd tried to do. The board meeting started at 10. The 0 a.m. sharp. 6 board members in total, including my parents' closest friends who'd been there since the company's founding. I'd sent them a summary of the situation the night before. Not everything, just enough to prepare them. They filed in looking shocked and concerned, asking questions I deflected until everyone was seated. I presented the financial irregularities first, showed them the shell companies, the diverted funds, the fake consulting fees, showed them 2 years of systematic theft totaling over $2 million. Watched their expressions harden as the scope of the betrayal became clear. Then I presented the corporate restructuring proposal. Emergency measures to protect the company, including immediate removal of Amin from all positions and titles, freezing of his accounts, and a complete audit of every financial decision he'd made in 3 years. The vote was unanimous. Less than 20 minutes to erase him from the company structure. After the meeting, my father's oldest friend, a man named Omar, who'd loaned my parents money to start the business 40 years ago, asked to speak with me privately. We sat in my office, and he told me my father would be proud. That I'd handled this with intelligence and strength. That not many people could have stayed calm enough to build the case I'd built while their life was in danger. I thanked him and admitted I hadn't felt calm. That most nights I'd barely slept. That every moment alone with Amin had felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. But that fear had been useful. It had kept me sharp, kept me careful, kept me alive. He told me something I needed to hear. That surviving wasn't the same as winning, but sometimes it was more important. That I'd done both. That my daughter would inherit a company untainted by her father's poison. After he left, I sat alone in my office and finally let myself feel it all. The terror, the rage, the grief for the marriage that had never been real, the relief that it was over. I cried for 20 minutes, ugly and cathartic, and when I was done, I washed my face in my private bathroom and fixed my hijab and walked back out looking composed. Detective Brennan came by at 3 p.m. with paperwork I needed to sign. She told me Amin was being held without bail, flight risk, plus the severity of the charges. She said Mariam was cooperating, had already admitted to providing the drugs and helping plan the timeline, that their text messages were damning, that the federal prosecutors expected this to go to trial within 6 months, and convictions were basically certain. I asked about Aisha. Detective Brennan said she'd given a full statement from the hospital, that she'd admitted to the affair, but insisted she hadn't known about any murder plot, that she thought Amin loved her, that they were going to be together after he divorced me, that when she got pregnant, he'd promised to leave me and make their relationship legitimate. She'd been a victim too, just a different kind, used and discarded and almost killed for the crime of believing a liar's promises. I told Detective Brennan I wanted to visit her if she'd allow it, to explain what had really happened, to make sure she understood she'd survived something she never should have had to face. That visit happened 2 days later. Aisha was being discharged from the hospital, and she agreed to meet me in a quiet cafe near her apartment. She looked fragile, dark circles under her eyes, moving carefully like everything hurt. We sat across from each other, and I told her everything, the whole plot. How the food had been meant for me. How she'd been collateral damage in someone else's murder plan. She cried, asked me why I wasn't angry at her. I told her I was angry. At Amin. At the situation. At the world that made women collateral damage in men's ambitions. But not at her. She'd been lied to, manipulated, used, just like I had been. We'd both survived him. That made us allies, not enemies. She asked if I hated her for sleeping with my husband. I told her honestly that I'd hated the idea of her for weeks. But that sitting there looking at her, seeing what he'd done to both of us, the hate had burned out. All that was left was a kind of exhausted sympathy. We talked for 2 hours. By the end, she'd told me everything about the affair, how he'd pursued her, made her feel special, promised her things he never intended to deliver, how she'd believed she was different, that he really loved her, that I was the obstacle to their happiness. She apologized. I told her I wasn't the one who needed her apology. She needed to forgive herself for believing someone who'd lied with every breath. Before we parted, she put her hand on mine and told me I was stronger than she'd ever be. I told her that wasn't true, that she'd survived poison meant for someone else, and was sitting here drinking coffee 3 weeks later. That strength came in different forms, that she'd find hers. I never saw her again after that day. She moved back to California where her family lived. Last I heard, she was in therapy and finishing her degree. I hope she found peace. She deserved at least that. 6 months later, I stood in the same office where this all began, my hand resting on a belly that had grown round and obvious. My daughter, I'd named her Amina, after my grandmother, a woman who'd survived wars and displacement, and a husband who died young, kicked against my palm like she was reminding me she was there. Amin's trial had lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. Conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, wire fraud, embezzlement. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 25 years federal prison with no possibility of parole for 15. Miriam got 12 years for her cooperation, but she'd serve every day knowing she'd helped plan the murder of a pregnant woman. I'd testified on the second day. Walked into that courtroom in a maternity dress and a cream-colored hijab, sat in the witness box, and told the jury exactly what had happened. How the smell of the stew had warned me. How I'd given it to someone else and watched them nearly die. How I'd found the messages planning my death. How he'd stood in our kitchen and lied to my face every day while I built the case that destroyed him. Amin's lawyer tried to make me look calculating. Asked if I'd ever really loved my husband, or if I'd just been waiting for an excuse to take over the company. I told him I'd loved the man I thought Amin was. That man had never existed. The real Amin had killed any love I had the morning he tried to poison me. The jury watched me testify for 3 hours, and I saw belief in their eyes. They knew I was telling the truth, that I'd survived through instinct and intelligence, not manipulation, that I was the victim who'd refused to die quietly. After the sentencing, I walked out of that courthouse and never looked back. Didn't watch him being led away. Didn't read the news articles. Didn't follow the appeals I knew would fail. He was gone from my life in every way that mattered. The rest was just paperwork. The company recovered faster than I expected. We restructured completely, brought in new leadership, rebuilt our supplier relationships. Within 4 months, we'd recovered the stolen money through insurance claims and seizure of Amin's assets. Within 6, we were more profitable than we'd been in 3 years. My parents flew back permanently. My father came out of retirement to help me navigate the transition. My mother set up the nursery in my house, painting clouds on the ceiling and buying tiny dresses that made her cry happy tears. They never said "I told you so" about Amin. They just held me when I needed holding and gave me space when I needed solitude. I promoted Iman to VP of Operations. She'd earned it 10 times over. On her first day in her new office, she brought me flowers and a card that said simply, "You taught me that surviving is a form of winning." I kept that card on my desk. The nightmares stopped around month 5. I'd been dreaming about the smell of that stew, about Aisha's screams, about Amin's face when he realized I knew everything. But gradually, those dreams faded, replaced by dreams about my daughter, about teaching her to be strong, about building a life where she never had to question her value. I gave birth on a Thursday morning in late October. 12 hours of labor, my mother on one side, Iman on the other. When they put Amina in my arms, she looked up at me with these dark, serious eyes, and I told her about her namesake, about strength that outlasted everything, about surviving what should have destroyed you. I didn't tell her about her father. That conversation could wait for years, maybe decades. For now, she just needed to know she was loved, protected, wanted, that she'd come into this world because her mother had been smart enough to trust her instincts when it mattered most. 3 months after Amina's birth, I was back at work part-time, running the company from my office, Amina in a bassinet beside my desk, Iman handling the day-to-day while I focused on strategic decisions. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life I'd fought for, and that made it valuable in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I still wear my hijab every day, still pray before dawn, still find peace in the rituals that ground me. But I understand now that my faith isn't about submission to anyone except God, that modesty and strength aren't contradictions, that the quiet woman in the headscarf can destroy you if you underestimate her long enough. People ask sometimes if I'm angry, if I feel like I lost years to a man who never deserved them. The answer is complicated. Yes, I'm angry about the betrayal, about the lies, about having to fear for my life in my own home. But I also learned something crucial about myself in those 3 weeks between the poisoning and the arrest. I learned I was stronger than I'd ever needed to be before, that I could be terrified and strategic at the same time, that love might blind you, but survival sharpens everything into perfect focus. That sometimes the worst thing that almost happens to you teaches you exactly who you are. On the day Amin was sentenced, a reporter asked me what I wanted people to know about my story. I told her I wanted women to trust their instincts, that if something feels wrong, it probably is, that the smell of danger is real even if you can't explain it, that your gut knows things your mind doesn't want to believe yet. I told her that survival isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's just refusing to eat the stew your husband made. Sometimes it's investigating when you should be trusting. Sometimes it's building your case in silence while your enemy thinks they've already won. I think about that morning constantly. The morning Amin brought me poison disguised as love. How close I came to eating it. How one moment of instinct saved 2 lives. How different everything would be if I'd ignored that warning. If I'd been polite instead of suspicious. If I'd trusted his smile instead of my gut. Amina is 6 months old now. She laughs when I sing to her, reaches for my hijab when I lean over her crib. She has no idea her father tried to murder her before she was born. She just knows safety, warmth, love. That's all she'll ever need from me. Last week I got a letter from Amin, forwarded through his lawyer, pages of apologies and explanations and justifications. I read the first paragraph, then threw it away without finishing. He wanted absolution, wanted me to understand his reasoning, wanted to explain how desperate he'd been, how much pressure he'd been under, how Miriam had influenced him. None of it mattered. No explanation could justify what he'd tried to do. No apology could undo the terror or repair the trust he'd shattered. He'd made his choices. Now he'd live with them for the next 15 years, minimum. I made my choices too. To survive, to fight, to protect my daughter, to rebuild my life from the ashes of a marriage that had been built on lies from the start. Those choices define me now more than any vow I took or any love I thought I'd found. So here I am. CFO turned CEO, wife turned widow in every way that matters, mother to a daughter who will grow up knowing her mama was strong enough to defeat a monster. I still live in Dearborn, still hear the call to prayer from my office window, still wake before dawn and find peace in the routine of faith. But now, when I look in the mirror, I see someone different. Not the obedient daughter my mother raised, not the trusting wife I tried to be, someone harder. Someone who knows exactly what she's capable of when survival is the only option. If you're listening to this story, if you've followed me this far through the darkness and back into light, I need you to know something. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it makes you breakfast, smiles at you over coffee, sleeps beside you at night, holds your hand and plans your death in the same breath. But your instincts know. Your gut recognizes danger even when your heart wants to deny it. Trust that. Trust yourself. And if you ever smell something wrong, literally or figuratively, don't ignore it. Don't be polite. Don't worry about seeming paranoid. Survive first. Explain later. I survived because I listened to the voice that told me something was wrong, because I gave that poisoned food to someone else. A decision that haunts me and saved me in equal measure. Because I was smart enough to investigate and careful enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike back. You might never face what I faced. I hope you never do. But if you ever find yourself questioning someone you love, doubting something that seems too good or too convenient or too perfectly timed, stop. Look closer. Dig deeper. Your life might depend on noticing what you're supposed to ignore. As for me, I'm done being the woman who didn't ask questions, who trusted too easily, who believed that love meant overlooking red flags. I'm raising my daughter to be smarter than that, stronger than that, to know that self-preservation isn't selfish, it's sacred. And you know what? I'm okay with being the bitter ending to someone else's story. I'm okay with being the wife who destroyed her husband's life before he could end hers. I'm okay with people calling me cold or calculating or ruthless. Because I'm alive. My daughter is alive. And the man who tried to murder us is in prison where he belongs. That's not a bitter ending. That's justice served with a side of survival. And I'll take it. If you've made it this far in my story, thank you for witnessing what happened. For believing that a quiet woman in a hijab could be strong enough to outmaneuver a killer. For understanding that sometimes the only revenge that matters is living well while your enemies rot. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Drop your city in the comments. Let me know this story reached you. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss other stories like this. Stories about women who refused to die quietly, who fought back with everything they had, who won. Because we do win sometimes, and that's a story worth sharing.